On the night of October 29, 1829, in a packed concert hall in Vienna, a man walked onto the stage and the crowd fell silent. Not out of respect, out of fear. His face was sunken. His skin was pale as wax. He was so thin that under the stage lights his body cast almost no shadow. He raised his bow, and then someone in the audience leaned over to the person beside them and whispered something. Something that would follow this man across all of Europe, from Paris to Prague, from Vienna to London. That he had made a deal with the devil. His name was Niccolò Paganini, and this is his story. Genoa, Italy, 1782. The city smells of salt and fish and old stone. It is loud, chaotic, alive. A port where ships from across the Mediterranean dock each morning carrying silk, spices, and stories. Into this city, in the autumn of that year, a boy is born. The third of 6 children. His parents are Antonio and Teresa Paganini. They are not wealthy. They are not connected. They have nothing to give their son except ambition. And Antonio Paganini has ambition enough for a dynasty. He puts a mandolin in young Niccolò's hands at age 5, a violin at 7. He does not ask if the boy wants to play. He demands it. Hours of practice each day. Scales, exercises, repetitions. If Niccolò stopped, there were consequences. Neighbors later recalled hearing the violin echo through the house late into the night. The same phrases over and over. Not joyful. Not free. Relentless. Music for young Niccolò was not a gift. It was a sentence. The boy began to exceed what his father could understand. At age 11, Niccolò gave his first public concert in Genoa. The audience was stunned. At 13, he was sent to study under Alessandro Rolla, one of the most celebrated violin teachers in all of Italy. Rolla listened to the boy play for less than an hour. Then he told Antonio Paganini that there was nothing left he could teach his son. The student had already surpassed the master, at 13 years old. But genius, it turns out, is a dangerous thing to carry. By 15, Paganini was performing solo tours across Italy, and by 16, he was falling apart. Away from his father for the first time in his life, Paganini discovered freedom, and he consumed it recklessly. Gambling, drinking, women. He disappeared from public life entirely, retreating to the countryside for nearly a year, living on a farm, barely touching his violin. The prodigy had become a cautionary tale. But something strange happened during that period of silence. He practiced alone. Without the pressure of his father, without the eyes of an audience, he began to experiment, to invent, to push the violin somewhere no one had ever taken it before. When he returned to the stage, he was no longer simply talented. He was otherworldly. In 1805, Napoleon's sister, Princess Elisa Bacciochi, appointed him as court violinist in Lucca. It was there that Paganini began performing feats that other musicians simply refused to believe were possible. He would tune his strings differently from every other violinist on stage, retuning his instrument mid-performance to reach notes others could not physically access. He kept his compositions under lock and key, delivering sheet music to the orchestra only minutes before each concert, so no one could study his methods. He performed entire pieces, full complex concert pieces, on a single string. Not as a gimmick, as a statement. I can do what no one else can, and I will show you. Europe had produced many great violinists. It had never produced anything like this. Milan, 1813. The Teatro, alla Scala. Paganini's debut at Italy's most prestigious concert hall. Tickets had sold out weeks in advance. The rumors had already preceded him. whispers about a violinist who played like something not entirely human. The audience that night included composers, critics, aristocrats, and ordinary people who had saved for months to be in that room. Paganini walked onto the stage, tall, skeletal, dressed entirely in black, his cheekbones sharp beneath pale skin, his fingers long and angular, almost wrong-looking, as if they belonged to a different kind of creature. He did not bow. He simply raised his violin and began. What the audience heard that night redefined what a violin was. His bow moved at speeds the eye struggled to follow. He performed harmonics that produced sounds more like a human voice than an instrument. He leapt across strings with a precision that left other violinists in the audience gripping their seats, their faces pale. And then, a sharp crack. One of the strings snapped. Paganini did not stop. The music continued, seamless, as if nothing had happened. Minutes later, another string broke. Still, he played. 2 strings. The audience had stopped breathing. Then came the third crack. 1 string remained, and in a move that would be described for decades in newspapers across Europe, Paganini finished the performance. On 1 string, with no sheet music, in front of a full concert hall at La Scala. A reporter from Leipzig who was present that night wrote, "Paganini is without question the foremost and greatest violinist in the world." But in the back of the hall, a different conversation was beginning. Because people who cannot explain what they have witnessed do not say, "I don't understand." They say, "There must be another explanation." Europe in the early 1800s was not a rational world. This was the era of Goethe's Faust, the story of a man who sells his soul to the devil for knowledge and power. It was a story that resonated deeply with a continent wrestling between faith and enlightenment, between the sacred and the profane. And into this world walked a man who looked like he had stepped directly out of that story. Paganini was unnaturally thin. Observers described him as cadaverous, skeletal. His fingers were impossibly long. Under candlelight, his hollow cheeks and dark clothing made him look less like a musician and more like something summoned. He cultivated this image consciously. He refused to explain his techniques. He locked his manuscripts away. He declined encores in his famous phrase, "Paganini non ripete." Paganini does not repeat. The rumors multiplied. Some said his mother had made a pact with the devil before his birth, trading his soul for genius. Others whispered that he had murdered a lover and restrung his violin with her intestines, that the screams heard from the stage were hers. Audience members in Vienna reported seeing a shadow standing behind him as he played, a shadow that moved its own arm independently, guiding the bow. Someone claimed lightning once struck the end of his bow during a performance. People began reporting Paganini doppelgangers, identical figures spotted in the audience while the real Paganini performed on stage. Some added horns, hooves, red clothes. The violin itself was already seen as the devil's instrument. In Renaissance paintings, death and the devil were frequently depicted holding violins. It was the instrument of taverns and dances, of carnal pleasure and sin. Paganini, who had the appearance of a specter and the abilities of something supernatural, was practically a myth assembled from parts that already existed. He understood this, and he used it. Every mystery he maintained was a ticket sold. Every rumor he refused to deny was a crowd that arrived larger than the one before. He had become something the 19th century had never quite seen before. A celebrity who understood his own mythology. 2 centuries later, historians and physicians have attempted to explain what Paganini actually was. The most compelling theory: he may have had Marfan syndrome, a genetic disorder that causes extreme height, a thin frame, and most crucially, unusual flexibility, and length in the fingers and joints. Paganini could reportedly play 3 octaves in a single handspan. He could reach intervals that other violinists, with entirely normal hands, simply could not access physically. Not because they lacked practice, because their bodies would not allow it. Some researchers also point to Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a condition causing hypermobile joints that could have allowed the kind of rapid fluid movements his audiences found impossible to comprehend. But here is the part that the scientific explanation tends to gloss over. Anatomy does not compose. Long fingers do not write the 24 caprices for solo violin, 24 pieces so technically demanding that professional violinists today still devote years to mastering them. Flexible joints do not invent left-hand pizzicato, or artificial harmonics, or techniques that fundamentally expanded what the instrument could express. Paganini didn't just use his unusual body. He built an entirely new language for the violin around it. And that, the act of creation, the obsessive refinement, the transformation of personal limitation into artistic innovation, that has no medical explanation. That is simply genius. In the spring of 1840, Paganini's body finally gave out entirely. He had spent his final years in Nice, voiceless from larynx cancer, too weak to perform. He died on May 27, 1840. Death came so suddenly that there was no time to call a priest. He received no last rites. And the church, which had heard the rumors, which believed on some level what the crowds had always whispered, refused to bury him. His embalmed body lay in the house where he died for 2 months. Then it was moved to the cellar, then to an abandoned leper house, then to a cement vat inside an olive oil factory. His son Achilles fought for years to secure a burial. The body was eventually moved to a private home near Nice, then across the sea to Genoa, then to a cemetery outside Parma. It was not until 1876, 36 years after his death, that Pope Gregory XVI finally authorized a proper burial. Niccolò Paganini was laid to rest in the Cimitero della Villetta in Parma, quietly, without ceremony, decades late. The world, even in his death, could not quite decide what he had been. Today, Paganini's beloved violin, the Guarneri del Gesù he acquired after a concert in Livorno, the instrument he called il cannone, the cannon, sits in a glass case in Genoa. It is played once a year, under careful conditions, by a curator to keep it alive. A violin that has not been on a stage in nearly 2 centuries, still being maintained, still being preserved. There is something in Paganini's story that makes people deeply uncomfortable, and it is not the devil. It is the possibility that one human being, through some combination of biology and obsession and suffering and genius, could achieve something so far beyond the norm that it genuinely looked supernatural to the people around him. That is harder to accept than a pact with evil. Because a pact with evil makes the extraordinary an exception, something outside the rules. But if Paganini was simply human, if this was simply what a person could become, given the right hands, the right obsession, and enough time alone in a room with a violin, then the rules we use to define human limitation may be less reliable than we thought. And maybe that is the most unsettling thing Paganini ever did. Not frighten an audience, but make us question what we believe is possible. Every episode of the Muse Chronicles is a story like this one. A genius, a myth, and the truth buried somewhere between the two. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if Paganini's story moved you, share it with someone who would appreciate it. Until next time.